Hi, on behalf of Editors BC and we're Vancouver, welcome to Editors Aren't Always Evil. With me is a panel of editors from Editors BC. We've got Maureen McGuigan, Francis Peck, Tara Avery, and I'll be your moderator, Kyle Hawk. So, the session came partly out of the idea that what people learn in school kind of formulates their idea of what an editor does. That we would be very strict and unyielding about certain things. And we talked about zombie rules and things like that, which we'll go into. But I think a good start would be, does anyone have any stories about something they learned in school that was wrong, that's haunted them since? I can start with one of you. There was one time, and I remember it was grade 6. I was writing on the chalkboard, and there's a knock on the door. And it's the principal of the school who wants to sit down in the class. So he comes, sits down, I turn back to the board, immediately he corrects me because I used the Oxford comma. My teacher corrects him. And they got into a yelling match while I'm just standing there with the chalk in front of the class. And yeah, that was probably my first experience of the idea that, yeah, people differ on these things, even in educational settings.
I mean, even in editorial settings, the Oxford comma is a good way to throw down and see, because people feel very strongly about that comma.
Absolutely. Oh, shall we go through it quickly? I love the Oxford.
I love the Oxford comma too.
I have a split personality because, so I've been a freelance editor my whole career, and so I'm used to going with or without, depending on the client's preference. But as a freelance writer, I spent decades not using the Oxford comma if the choice was left to me. Okay. But I find, and maybe someone can explain why this might be, now that I'm writing creatively again, I've written 2.5 novels, and I use the Oxford comma in the novels.
I blame AP.
Could see that.
Yeah, that could be, or the Canadian style, or CP style, which are kind of
press styles basically like to use as little punctuation as possible because they're trying to conserve space in their. Yeah, it's the serial comma. So what's one of the famous?
If you have a series of things like, say, apples, oranges, and bananas, the Oxford comma or serial comma is the one that you may or may not put in front of the and. Yeah. So, and it's optional. Eats, shoots, and leaves.
Yes. The book, the famous, which could mean that the panda eats, shoots, and leaves, or the panda murders someone.
Yeah, so basically, as an editor, I think most of us are used to switching as necessary to house style. One of the things I find with the Oxford comma is if someone writes without it, generally they're writing for the style of writing without it and vice versa. And switching it is the most horrific thing as an editor. And I've done that. I've switched a book, and everyone here's done it, switched from Oxford comma to non and vice versa. It's horrible because it really affects the way you write certain things. Mm-hmm. And it shoots and leaves.
So that you don't have a murderous panda.
Yes. Yes, we are here to prevent murderous pandas.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So
and that's not evil.
No.
I mean, that's good.
Yes. That said, we're not all about black and white.
We aren't. And I think too, that sort of points out, because all of us, I think, have worked or do work freelance. Like the editor who isn't able to switch between, the preferences of a client, like the grammatically sound preferences of a client, is basically cutting themselves out of a lot of potential work. So, even though I may personally, as a creative writer, love and always use the Oxford comma, if somebody comes to me, and sometimes it depends on the kind of English you're using too, because it's much more common, ironically, since Oxford is in the UK, it's much more common in the UK to not use that serial comma. So, some of my clients are British, and every time you have to change the way you approach the manuscript because they're coming at things with a certain set of rules that don't necessarily apply to US English or Canadian English, or where some or the other apply. So, you know, if you as an author really love some convention and your editor says, absolutely not, you can't do this, you probably can.
But to the point of Oxford, it is also called the Harvard Cup, amongst other things. So there was usage everywhere in every.
And the Oxford stuff, like Oxford uses it.
Yeah.
So it's not all of the UK that's outside of.
But anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was gonna just add in another strange twist that Oxford University Press's communications department does not use the Oxford comma. So it's a dog.
So here's the thing you learn about editing. If you get 10 editors in a room, you'll get probably 10 different answers to some things, because even the things that we grew up with your English teacher telling you is a hard and fast rule, it's very unlikely that when it comes down to it and you're actually working on your piece, that rule is either hard or fast.
Yeah, there's basically English does not make sense as a language. It's piecemeal taken from here and there, and
6 languages in a trench coat.
yes. Yeah, French and Spanish have international bodies that determine what is correct. English does not. So which is one of its strengths, if you ask me. It's free form, you can shift in different directions, and there's no one to say that it's absolutely wrong. But because of that, teachers tend to shortcut a lot. You know, I before E. Well, then you have to add except after C. Then you have to add or when sounded as A as a neighbor. And there's still, then you go to science class.
Yeah.
SCI. But, yeah, so let's talk about some of the other zombie rules. For example, ending a sentence with a preposition. Basically, I put a lot of these forward as Victorian fads, which they were. In essence, they were about a certain class of people deciding that English should be more like Latin. So you don't split an infinitive because they don't do that in Latin, where infinitives are one word.
Yes.
So
to boldly go. Many people, including the Starship Enterprise, boldly go places. So, you know, it's.
And when they updated it for the next generations, where no one has gone before, but they kept to boldly go.
Yes. Because
They didn't to go boldly. No.
This is also, and I will put this out there, I'll name names. Some of you may have heard of things like Grammarly, and Grammarly will guide you wrong many times. And this is something, because Grammarly, I know, is a big stickler. It always points out split infinitives. It always points out ending sentences with prepositions, and it's wrong.
Well, to be fair, okay, Grammarly and Word, which people are talking more. Word's grammar check and spell check. No trust in, but one way or the other, these things were always only meant as suggestions.
Yes.
Check it, because again, English does not make sense. You're not going to get AI telling you, or a program or anything, but likewise, it makes English very hard to write for AI.
Oh yeah. Because especially when you're, I don't know how many of you guys are doing like creative writing, but anytime you introduce the variables that are involved with creative writing, you're going to get even farther away from AI like Grammarly being able to help you, because it doesn't understand nuance and it doesn't understand poetry. It doesn't understand the cadence that you might be working with. Like, you know, if it tells you suddenly, you can't split this infinitive, readers won't like that, but you're in the middle of dialogue, you're like, well, nobody talks like this. So it's one of those things where hopefully a human editor will be able to look at something with a human brain and pick up the nuance that you're picking, that you're putting down. And then what we're looking for is less like adherence to strict rules as an internal consistency that's going to make your piece, accessible to a reader, basically. You don't want to confuse your reader, because then they might put your book down and never pick it up again, or not buy it at Chapters or something like that. So I think in a lot of ways, that's where your editor is your ally in trying to figure out they're the go-between between you and your eventual readership. And their job is trying to make sure that your readership keeps reading your book.
I often put it forward that the job of the editor, in large part, is to be the readership.
Yeah.
And beyond accessible to the audience, it's also about being clear. Clarity is important because English being very, very loose, it's possible that 99% of people will understand this sentence as you meant it, but you'll have one who, will read it this way. And then it comes down to making the decision. Are you willing to lose that one reader for a moment, have them skip back, be thrown out of the book, or short story or poem or whatever, and have to go back? Or can you make the balance? And as editors, I think that's part of our job too.
It's worth adding too, I think that, you're probably going to direct the discussion this way eventually, Kyle, but it's just in case some who are watching and in the group aren't familiar with this. I think a lot of people do think of editors as the ones who are looking at the grammar of the sentence and the spelling and making sure that capitalization is consistent and so on. But we're just talking about copy editing there, of course. And there are other equally, if not more important levels of editing that happen, like, for example, structural editing, where the editor will actually evaluate the content before you ever start fiddling with the words and the sentences. And that, I think, is an area where editors really stand forth as being the ally of the author, because if a manuscript comes in and it's disorganized in some part, or let's say it's a piece of fiction and there's a character that's not as well developed as the other characters, that maybe seems a bit superficial or something like that, the editor as an outside reader is one who will point that out for the author and maybe suggest some revisions. So, and I wasn't sure, Maureen, I guess we didn't really say what our specialties are as editors or anything like that, but
I'm actually a technical editor.
Okay. So you would
Definitely about making things clear.
Yeah,
Exactly.
You would be
My whole
catching
job.
logical problems all the time, I would imagine.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Yeah, absolutely. Making sure that, because I work with engineers primarily, and their clients aren't engineers all the time. So trying to make sure that what they've written, all their technical speak, can actually be understood by their clients and the people that their clients are trying to communicate to. Usually we're trying to tell people why they need to change something in their facility, and it's really important for them to be able to sort of pass that on to the people that are going to give them money to make that change to the facility. So, right, it's very important.
And I guess generally, when there's not a lot of crossover between people who are high-level engineers and high-level writers. So basically, people have a tendency to write to themselves, and that's another thing where editors fit in across the board, is that, okay, you might be seeing this is your intent, but this is how it could be read.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes up quite often, I'm guessing, with technical writing.
That's it. Yeah, it does.
Give a fun example.
Actually, a lot of years ago, I was working in a marketing team and doing award submissions. And one of our civil engineering leads was very adamant that he needed to have an Oxford comma, or he didn't want to have an Oxford comma somewhere. And he wouldn't listen to me. He was very skeptical of anybody that was corporate. And finally I went and I brought him Chicago Manual, and I brought him some examples and I explained to him why I needed that comma there. He never questioned me again.
Do you see though how it always comes back to the Oxford
Always,
comma? Why-
always, yes.
I feel this discussion should have been titled something like
Next year.
Oxford.
Except we only have an hour.
That isn't always evil.
Yeah.
No, I think editors could go on forever about the Oxford comma, because
I mean, I know I'm part of a few different editor groups on Facebook, and every, couple of months, someone will mention the forbidden Oxford comma, and it just devolves into like fighting.
Okay, let's get into other fights.
Yeah.
Let's talk comma splices.
Oh.
That's
Okay,
a
well,
great response.
yeah, I'm responding only because so I don't want to be a devil's advocate or anything like that. But you know, so there's a great example of another grammatical issue. You know, a comma splice is technically an error, but of course some kinds of writing are filled with comma splices, including
Well,
dialogue.
Sorry,
But-
just before you go on, let's explain what it is.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just in case.
exactly.
So essentially, comma splices where there's the comma separating what could be two standalone sentences.
If only we had punctuation that was designed for that.
Yeah. But
Oh,
you
but
know,
We do. It's the semicolon.
Conflate things, but sorry, Francis, I give you up.
yeah, well, I'm probably not the best person to answer that. Maybe I spent my entire life teaching grammar and correct grammar and imposing it as a copy editor and as a proofreader. But I think just throw it out here as a higher level matter, and then we can come back to the details of punctuation if we wish. But I think that when we're talking about the role of the author and the editor, I mean, some of it, yes, is making sure that the manuscript is technically correct, except when it's okay for it not to be technically correct. Like again, in poetry or dialogue, there's a famous anecdote, about Raymond Chandler back in the day. He was a hard-boiled noir author whose characters would speak ungrammatically because a lot of them
Right.
were thugs and whatnot. And he had submitted a story to, I'm pretty sure it was the Atlantic magazine, and it came back with all the dialogue edited to be grammatically correct. And you can
Very
Google
good,
it.
sir.
He wrote this. He wrote this very now famous letter to the editor of the magazine, saying, "To the purist who
It is a gorgeous
corrects
letter.
my proofs." And he goes on to say that when I split an infinitive, I mean to split it, and I want my characters to speak like the way that they do. But anyway, I'm digressing already. But the point that I guess I was getting at is that the grammar and stuff is such a tiny part of what editors do. And I'm personally on this panel to communicate to authors out there, assuming that a lot of you who are watching this are more on the author side of the equation, that it's not worth getting into arguments about Oxford commas and comma splices and so on. The editor is the person who's going to tell you your character is 14 here, and then all of a sudden she's about to
Yes.
write her driver's license exam. Like, that doesn't make sense because you can't do that when you're 14. And and the person who says, well, in this part of your technical documentation, you've said that you are allowed to contravene ISO or whatever under certain circumstances, but over here you say that you can't do that. So there are logical inconsistencies, and that's where the editor saves the author's bacon again and again.
I sometimes joke with authors that I'm there to point out these things so that one person on Goodreads doesn't.
Yes.
Because I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Goodreads, but man, the people who review books on Goodreads are
Not all.
not always, but man, they can be really, really harsh, and they'll nitpick the smallest things. So basically, the editor is there going like, if you don't want somebody to point this out on Goodreads later, you might want to address it now.
And yeah, that actually, there's self-publishing authors that have people who put that one thing as an issue in the Amazon review, and books have been taken down because of things. It's getting very odd right now.
Yeah,
It's
that's
still kind of a Wild West thing that hasn't settled down.
yeah. I mean, it's getting better, I think. But yeah, that's a whole panel on its own, the vagaries of
Right.
how
But as
self-publishing works.
an example of what Francis was saying, I recently pointed out, you do realize that in this scene you've written, this cat would now be 35 years old. So that's gotta change.
It's an immortal cat.
Yes.
Question.
I just have a question. I'm not sure if we're allowed
No,
to.
please.
Just on that idea of, reading for consistency, what are your guys' feelings about being a sensitivity reader?
Okay, I'm just gonna repeat the question for the sake of the hybrid audience. But as regards consistency, what are our feelings about sensitivity?
I mean, this is a thing that's been increasingly increasing awareness is being brought up about sensitivity reading, and sensitivity reading is basically, for anybody who's maybe not familiar with it, it's basically you send your manuscript or your piece to a sensitivity reader who has experience with the specific issue or thing that you've written about that you maybe don't have experience with. So, it can be, queer experience, or even I've done a sensitivity reading by a male author. Look, he wanted a sensitivity reading on how his female character came across, and it was bad. And I had to tell him, and he was glad that I told him, because he said he knew going in that something wasn't right, but he couldn't really put his finger on it. And I was like, oh, I can. So yeah, so I mean, I think that, at least in my view, it's anything again that's going to add a layer of authenticity or honesty to something. And if you're unsure as the author, then I think it is good to get that opinion of somebody who might be able to point out things that you don't know that you don't know,
Absolutely. It's another layer of a reader who's going to flag the things that are going to pull readers out of your story or your document, and sort of trying to fix those ahead of time.
And now it can be interesting sometimes how those readings play out. I mean, as an author, I've submitted parts of my novel to some different readers to get their feedback on things. With my current novel, there's a gay male couple, and I had a friend who's a gay male read part of it because one of them was using the word faggot. And it was a word I used very intentionally because of the age of the character and the way that it was being used. And there was, anyway, a lot of feelings around it and stuff. But I did want to run it by somebody to say, is this going to come across okay? Because that is a potentially derogatory word, but used in the context I didn't think it was, but I wanted to make sure. So anyway, he read it and okayed it and so on. And I thought, okay, fine. But I was thinking about a friend of mine who's an author who had written a mystery thriller novel, and he hired an editor. He self-published this novel, and he hired an editor before self-publishing it. And he is a man, and his editor was a woman, and she did comment on one of the female characters in his book and said a few things that struck her as being perhaps not quite realistic, and particularly about the way that the female character interacted with the male character, who was an older man, former cop and so on, like 60-ish or something, and she just flagged a few things. And he came to me and he said, my editor didn't like these things, and I don't agree with her, and does she even have the right to tell me that about my characters, And I said, well, so she's pointing out that the man is pretty chauvinistic in his dealings with the woman, and that the way she's reacting doesn't seem to be that realistic. And so it's your job now as the author to decide how you're going to react to that. And he said, but my character is chauvinistic, and I want to keep him that way. And so I said, well, that's fair enough. So it's something else to keep in mind. An editor may well flag something like that. It doesn't mean that it necessarily needs to change. The author's job is not always to say you have to change this, but it's to ask the right questions, and to flag the things that you as an author need to question. Like, oh, did you mean for your character to seem chauvinistic in his dealings with this woman? If the answer is yes, well, then you've done what you wanted.
And it's also, there's not a lot of difference in between the character seeming chauvinistic and the author seeming chauvinistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it takes little things to make that difference.
But then, in following that instance, so if he was with a publishing house, not self-publishing, where is the point where the publisher back to the editor and says, no, you gotta change that?
Okay, so we've got another question. The difference between freelance and working with a publishing house, where would the publisher potentially step in and back the editor and or the author? So.
It's a good question, because when you're working with a publishing house, if they say, we're not gonna accept the manuscript unless you change this, then it's still the author's choice. But that choice may be, is this publisher gonna publish my book or not? You know, like when you're self-publishing, you are the publisher. So you're making these choices that would be, you know, somebody else would be making maybe in a publishing house. You're doing all the roles and wearing all the hats. But in a publishing house, they basically, you know, depending on the contract that you've signed, and there's a lot of complicated legal stuff that goes into those. I think there's no real easy answer to that because it still does usually boil down to like you as the author have a choice, but it might not be one where you also get your book published by that publisher.
Yeah, and it's important to remember, you know, with the traditional publisher, if you sign with a traditional publisher who's bringing out your book, they always sign authors with a kind of vision for the book, and they'll usually have discussed that with the author, you know, via the editor. Oftentimes there'll be a discussion, you know, in which you talk about, well, here's what, you know, what the book looks like, and here's how we're likely to position it in the market. And if it's going to be a controversial book, for example, everybody will be very clear about that. It's going to be controversial, and the publisher may say, yes, we're fine with this portrayal, that portrayal, and so on. So it's important to note that. And yeah, then you as an author, when you sign a contract, you are agreeing to bring out the book that you've all agreed that it's supposed to be, and that may mean changing a few things if you need to. But I don't know, in my own experience, I mean, I'm traditionally published, and my own experience in dealing with my publisher is that they've been very author sensitive, and you know, in some cases of wording, I have gotten into little wranglings about the wording sometimes, and I've had a few things flagged. Is this really, well, faggot was a good example in one passage, you know, and we had a lot of talk about that one word, understandably, but we kept it. I kept it, and I could bring someone else's reading forth as a reason for keeping it, but it was because it was contextual, and it was coming from a person who had some self-loathing, you know, like didn't respect himself and his gayness and so on, and it was very authentic for him to refer to himself as a faggot.
And presumably clear in the context
Yes,
of reading.
yeah,
So,
exactly, yeah.
But very much, you know, there's no single standard for publishers. You could have like big five, maybe a little closer, but we're in an age where there's so many small press publishers. The standards and dynamics are going to vary wildly. I talked not long ago with an author who apparently signed a contract that gave the publishing house control to the point where for some reason they wanted to put the title of her book on the cover upside down, and did. And she was committed to it. She couldn't back out. Which is an odd thing, but think the weirdest little things can happen. So basically, if you are getting into any kind of publishing contract, read it. Read it carefully.
And even, I mean, to take it back to the freelance side, I mean, I'm usually very clear with my authors that what I'm offering are suggestions and not dictates, you know, like they still have, you know, I'm going to make suggestions and give you reasons why I'm making those suggestions based on all of the various bits and pieces of information that I'm pulling together. But it's still your story, you know. I'm not here to change your story or to, you know, impose anything. I mean, you're the author, I work for you. Like, you're the one that's paying me, so you can say, actually, I mean, you still have to pay me, but you don't have to accept that, that, you know, suggestion. Or sometimes, and this has happened to me, where I make a suggestion, and because of my suggestion, the author realizes that they weren't saying what they wanted to say, you know, that in fact, the you know, section or whatever wasn't doing what they'd intended. And so my question was like, oh, that's not what I wanted that to bring up at all. And so that's a really valuable piece of information, because they realize they have to go back and fix whatever went off the rails that led to that situation or that, you know, misunderstanding of a situation. And I think for me, that's where the, you know, there's this sort of mythology of the editor, you know, kind of like hovering over the manuscript with a red pen, just destroying pages and, you know, tearing it to pieces. And first of all, if writers stop writing, we don't have work. So we don't want to destroy anybody and stop them from writing, because then we don't have jobs either. So really for me, when I'm looking at stuff, yeah, if I'm making a suggestion or I'm pointing out that a character is not, you know, they suddenly have a personality change halfway through the book, which was what happened when I read the manuscript the man had written. The woman just suddenly, like, she started one way and then she was crying all the time, and I was like, what? We don't do this. So, you know, there was a reason, there was a psychological, you know, reasoning why I was like, hey, this just doesn't, the arc kind of, she falls off in the middle, like, why did she suddenly become like this? And so that kind of thing is, you know, those are suggestions that are ultimately meant for the writer's good, not to be, you know, some mad red pen wielding maniac.
Yeah, there's one of my editorial colleagues has a really nice way of putting it. She says that editors are like the makeup and lighting people of the film world.
Oh.
They're there to make the authors look their best.
I'm gonna steal that.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? But that, I think that's a really apt description of what a good editor is there for. A good editor is there to make you and your manuscript look as good as possible, and that's where the suggestions come from. And I think that's a good way of gauging if you're working with an editor, whether it's a good fit. I'm not saying you, again, assuming people are mainly thinking about writing themselves, but it's a really great way of gauging the relationship that you have with your editor. You need to feel like the editor's on your side and they're there to make your product look as good as possible. And so, and their suggestions, even if they seem, you know, even if they feel unacceptable to you at first, or they seem critical or whatever, give it a little bit of time, first of all, for the criticism to settle and you know, you process it. We all, as when we're authors, we don't like any kind of criticism at all, never. But it takes a day or two, and then, you know, the ideas might percolate, and you may realize that the critical suggestions or the strange suggestions or the seemingly unacceptable suggestions are going to make your writing better in the end.
I think as an author, you know, there's that moment where, or I don't want to hear that, and then at 3 a.m. wake up, oh damn, you're right.
Yeah. Now I have to fix it.
Or they're half right, which is another thing, you know, which editors can be wrong, but the idea is to get the author thinking about this or that.
Yeah.
And going back to publishing versus freelance again, I would say that in traditional publishing dynamic, the editor is the publisher's advocate to the author, but they're also the author's advocate to the publisher. In the freelance world, it's a little looser. It's the author's advocate to the readership and vice versa. And that's a bit of a stickier thing at times. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the author has complete control there and does not have to accept anything. And I'm sure we've all done freelance and had something that really, really should go in or been waved off.
You're like, all right, if you must. Yeah, I mean, I think too, you know, in that relationship, there can be great editors out there that are not great editors for you. And I will often, like, I'll say that when people reach out to me, I'm like, you know, we want to make sure that we're a good fit, because, you know, you're putting your baby in my hands, and you want to make sure, and it goes both ways too, because sometimes there are authors that were just like, I just don't know if we're gonna gel. Like, if somebody wants a really, you know, tough love kind of drill sergeant editor, like, that's not me. Like, I'm just, but some people love that. Like, that is what they're looking for. And so it's okay when you're like, if you're looking for an editor, it's okay to reach out to a bunch of them and, you know, have a bit of a back and forth, maybe, get some sample edit or something like that so that so you get a sense. Because I mean, this person is someone you're going to be working with pretty closely over the lifetime of that manuscript, and maybe more if, the client that I've worked with the most, I think I've edited like 15 or 16 of her books, so you could end up, spending a lot of time with this person. You want to make sure that it's somebody that you feel has your best interests at heart and that you feel a connection with, honestly. Like, as much as that sounds like, speed dating, it's kind of like.
Well, it is a relationship. There's a co-parenting angle.
Yeah.
Maureen, I'm thinking of your situation where you're in-house, right? Like, you're in an organization and you're editing the work of people you work with. So they're not choosing you in this freelance way, right? Like, so do you get more or less pushback than we might in the freelance world? How does it go?
It depends. I have colleagues who definitely bring me stuff to read for them. An email that needs to be just right and it's kind of touchy and whatever. And they do sometimes. And there are times where I've misunderstood the technical. So there is and there isn't. It's a little bit different. It's more often that I'll have edited their content in one way and they'll agree to it, but then it goes to the client and the client comes back and says, no, you're telling us something that we can't say. We don't want to put that out there because
you're being a little too clear.
Yeah, exactly. So that we kind of end up having that dynamic where it's almost like I have two clients. So it's more like a traditional publishing kind of environment there. That's interesting.
But it's something that figures into all editing to an extent. I'm assuming more for you in a technical writing sense, legal concerns.
Yeah, there's words that we're not allowed to use. And that's the place actually that we get the most pushback. For a long time, our corporate style guide said, you must never say expert. But when you're editing a report or a white paper that's written by a PhD who is the technical expert in this field in the world, yeah, I'm allowed to use that word. And, legal would say, no, you're not. Yeah, we are. We're going to say it anyway.
In this case.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a slightly different dynamic.
Okay, since legal is on the table, song lyrics. You see the look
Comes
everyone
up.
wants. It's coming.
Every editor that's ever had to deal with song lyrics.
Yeah, people, authors love to put song lyrics in works or quote extensively, maybe from things other than songs too. But yes, you have to secure permission to reprint excerpts, especially from songs, sometimes that are very short. And part of the problem is that the definition of what of what exactly you need to seek permission from the publisher from is a little bit unclear. But yes, so I remember editing a book for an author, a nonfiction book, and he started every chapter with a snippet of song lyrics.
I had one of those too.
And which was great. The lyrics really fit what he was writing about and so on. But, there were 4 lines from a tragically hip song or something like that. And it's like, you're going to have to go to the tragically hip, or whoever
Management
writes their management and secure permission to use their lyrics in your book, because this is a substantial excerpt from the song. And in almost all cases, you're going to have to pay if you get the permission, which you probably aren't going to get. You might, but if you do, you're going to have to pay. So, when I signed with my publisher for my first novel, I had a couple of little bits of song lyrics, and being an editor, I knew that I couldn't quote too much from a song, so I kept them very short, and I had interspersed them with other words so that it wasn't a straight quote, you know what I mean? So quote a couple of words from the song, and then the character says a couple of things, and then quote another couple of words from the song, just so that we weren't going to have to go through the business of seeking permissions. But that's a big deal.
Yeah,
Big deal.
it is. It is common because you do all this research looking into it. Basically there's what's called fair use. Like what can you use in the context of a creative work? And it's not clear. So you want to err on the side of the thing that's not going to get you sued.
Yeah.
Well, more than that, it's, you don't have to be in the wrong to be sued.
Yeah.
So the idea is you don't want to put out something that's going to attract bad legal attention.
Yeah.
There's, well, Disney at one point was.
Don't mess with the mouse, you guys.
Yeah,
Like
don't mess with the mouse. Marvel at one point, I remember when I was a kid, we got US stations from Rochester when I was in Ottawa. But they sued like this tiny little company because there was a guy in Spider-Man costume in the background of an ad.
Yeah.
And at the time, Marvel had a thing where any lawyer anywhere who pointed something out to Marvel got to represent them against that. So there had every little lawyer, every smaller lawyer, I should say.
back in the early days of the internet, every time, people who wrote fan fiction, there would always be like these long disclaimers before anything that they wrote that's like, I don't own this, Fox owns this, please don't sue me. And sometimes people would still get like letters from Fox's lawyers or quite famously Anne Rice's. So, like it's a thing that has been very alive and especially related to writing in the public consciousness for a while. Song lyrics can get really messy really fast.
There's also,
You can quote song titles though.
yes.
Mhm.
Titles are fair game. You cannot copyright a title.
Nope.
There is basically, I can't remember what I was going to say. But no, yeah, titles are fair game. And when you consider the title is usually some of the lyrics, it's a good way to avoid
Yes.
the song. Yeah. There's a difference between quoting the title line and saying the title line of and song title.
And you can also paraphrase.
Yes.
Like if a song is about something, you can figure out a way to write about what the song is about in a way that the reader is going to know what song you're talking about without you actually using the lyrics of the song.
I like what Francis was talking about.
Yeah.
You did with evoking lyrics by like few and tossing in other words.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm currently in my second novel that I'm doing edits on right now. I'm trying to get away with a sentence in which the song comes on the radio and the character is thinking and the character says something about, here comes this song. It's that little ditty about Jack and Diane, which I'm hoping will pass as a paraphrase rather than.
Right.
Anyway, I think
I have another question.
Sure.
For the freelance editors, have you found over time when you're working with somebody with their first manuscript, there's suggestions that you're commonly making?
Okay, the question is for freelance editors specifically, when working with someone on a first manuscript, are we finding that there are questions and issues that recur that we're finding common? And I would say the easy answer is yes, but not just on first manuscripts, the same one on the second and third.
Yeah, and I think it depends so much too on who the author is. So sometimes you'll get a manuscript from someone who's a subject matter expert, like I'm thinking about the sorts of authors you work with. And so their content, that the subject is nailed down, the content is really good, but they're not writers first. And so there will be a lot of basic things like, there may be using wordy structures, there may be if they're engineers, giving more detail than the reader really needs. There might be some things like not enough concrete examples or anecdotes in the writing to make it come alive. On the other hand, sometimes you'll get a manuscript. I'm thinking of one that I worked on. It was the first book by a journalist. So she's a trained up journalist, and so of course can write, better than average right away. And yet she had come up through the newspaper ranks, and she was a daily journalist. She was a reporter, so she was used to writing news articles. And of course, with a news article, you always lead with the most important information, and then the background and so on comes much later in the piece. She had written a book of narrative nonfiction, true crime, that had a lot of suspense in it. And at the beginning of every chapter, she gave everything away.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Like she led with, you know, the outcome of the chapter and then kind of backed up to give all the background and everything. And so it was her first book. So it was a very particular thing, but she needed the slightest bit of nudging. You know, I just really needed to say, you know, for this book, you need to unfold the story and build the anticipation and put that key thing at the end, not the beginning. So it's so variable, I find, just depending on the author and how much of a writer they are versus how much of, say, a content specialist.
But even then, like, you have some books that sell very well that, in my view, you know, say you have a character who is a professor, and every 5 pages they stop to give you a lecture about all the stuff that clearly the author has researched and wants you to know, Dan Brown. And so to me, like, that is, I find that like one of the most egregious examples of the sort of show versus tell. Like, your character is created in such a way that all they're doing is telling the audience information without the audience being involved in the discovery of that information, you know, like being a student sitting at a lecture. Like, that's not usually what I'm looking for when I pick up a piece of fiction. And so for me, like, both as a reader and an editor, like, if I start to feel like I'm getting too much of the author's research or their subject matter expertise or whatever, and it makes the characters feel just like mouthpieces or flawed, then it's very hard for me to get emotionally engaged in that story, because I'm just like,
Yeah, it's called the information dump.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
the
info
editorial
dumping.
term for it. Just don't give an information dump.
Yeah.
It has to come organically.
I was gonna say, you beat me to it, that we've all used the 3 little words, show, don't tell.
Yeah.
And it comes from an Anton Chekhov quote, which, don't tell me the moon is shining, show me the glint of light in broken glass. And I find telling authors that full quote
It's nice.
really evokes it much more than show, don't tell. Show, don't tell. Don't tell me the moon is shining, show me the glint of light in broken glass. And that's just it. You can have this detail that reflects all the facts you want to know. And yeah, the exposition, there's always another way to do it. Sometimes, yeah, you do want a little bit of an info dump because it suits this or that, but it's rare. And to be honest, it's an ask to the reader that you don't necessarily want to make if you can avoid it.
But I'll say this to all writers: don't worry about this in your first draft. These are not first draft problems. Like,
Yes.
your first draft, your very first draft, which no one should see except you probably, is you telling yourself the story. Like, just get it down, because you can fix words on pages. You cannot fix words that are in your brain. Like, it doesn't work. You won't ever finish. So, you know, the first draft is not what you're showing your editor either. Like, you know, just get that story down for yourself so that you have that lump of clay to work with. Then you can go back and start figuring out like which bits you know never went anywhere or which you need more of, and then you start to build that shape that you can start to, you know, show people and refine and you know, eventually get it.
We talked earlier about different types of editing, so this is a good place to bring up developmental, substantive. The idea that, okay, now that you've got this lump of clay, well, chapter 16 would work better as chapter 3. Things like that. Does anyone want to talk about?
Well, this is also why you don't do like sentence level stuff in the beginning, because if you're working with a developmental editor and they tell you chapter 16 has to go, like it doesn't serve a purpose, then what's the point of working on all of those sentences in chapter 16 that you're just gonna chuck? You know, it's a waste of your money, and that's, you know, like you want to make sure that your structure, your big picture, your arc, your character development, everything is solid before you start worrying about the details.
Yeah, an editor friend of mine says there's no point manicuring the nails if you're going to amputate the hand.
Yeah.
Oh, what was the title of this session again? We aren't always evil.
Okay,
That's
that editor's a little evil.
But it's memorable.
It's great.
That's a great line.
Yeah.
Structure is important in any kind of writing. So whether it's a nonfiction piece or a fiction piece, and taking that time to really understand the flow of the document or the manuscript, and making sure that you're saying what you want to say before you actually get down to the nitty gritty. You can kind of tell that from the organization of the document.
Yeah.
Basically intent and outcome, it's a leap across buildings, one building to another.
Yeah, and it's unfortunately a bit of a phenomenon that sometimes editors will be approached by authors who say, I have this book that I've written, could you edit it for me? And I would like you to do a line edit, like do a copy edit, check for the Oxford commas, the comma splices, all that kind of thing. And the editor will get into reading the book and will realize, but, there are these really glaring structural issues, bigger picture issues with the book. And that's difficult. It's difficult when that happens. It typically happens because the author has maybe not involved an editor at an earlier stage to evaluate the structure. And so it is important, I think, to be, people are always asking me, well, when should I hire an editor? At what point should I think of hiring an editor or getting an editor involved with the manuscript? And, I always say, well, the manuscript, first of all, needs to be as good as you can possibly make it, whether that's you by yourself or ideally you with some readers who've given you input, as good as it can possibly be. But I really think if authors are hiring editors directly, I personally think their money is best spent if they hire the editor to give them a big picture edit, like to say what's working well in the book and what isn't working well, rather than going through and dealing with the spelling and the commas and so on, because you need to get that structure right from the beginning.
Ultimately, commas are superficial, but if, your character arc falls flat, then nobody's gonna care about the commas.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the story didn't work, the characters are flat, but the comma
Those
placement,
commas,
Yeah.
you're never gonna read that.
I'm gonna find that on Goodreads.
But that brings us back to what we were talking about some time ago, the types of editing.
I thought you were going to say the Oxford comma.
Oh,
You're going to try to end it. That's good.
We have minutes left, so we're not going back to the Oxford comma. But the idea being knowing what type of editing you're looking for, and I'm sure we've all had the ask from authors that, well, I don't want to deal with the commas. I don't want to deal with lead by articles alone. And it's a little weird to turn off this part of the process as an editor. We're going to notice things in general. It's whether or not we note them to you, and we may as well note them. Because the other thing is, if you're not dealing with this, well, then we need a different fix. And it's probably complicating the situation for you as an author.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that makes authors worth their pay is their long experience in doing what they do. And editors, I meant to say, I think I said authors. Sorry, what makes editors worth their pay? You can tell
We hope authors are
I have
worth
a
their pay.
split-
We really do. When we
exactly.
send those books out there, we really are hoping the authors get paid.
Yeah. This is my split personality at the moment, half author, half editor, but no editors. Because oftentimes an author, especially if they're a newer author, they might not know what needs to be fixed. And, it's again, a very common thing that the dialogue of all the characters will sound exactly the same. Every character sounds like every other character. And an editor knows to look for that. If an editor's editing something with dialogue, they'll evaluate that from the beginning and give you feedback. And yeah, there are these various other problems that commonly occur that editors know to look for.
Okay, so we are running out of time. So we're just going to go through the panel and ask for a wrap up. Any general thoughts you want to put forward to authors as an editor, Maureen?
I think that it's just treat your editor as a team member, as a partner in the process. I think that's or not, maybe not treat them, but look at them as that, because that's what we are. We're there really to help your words shine. And as long as you've got that mindset, it's gonna be fine.
Francis?
Yeah, and I'd build on that and say be prepared as an author for the instant feeling of, I hate everything you just told me, editor, because what I really want is you to tell me that this work is wonderful and ready to win prizes. Be prepared for that reaction, give the feedback some time to settle, and then you're in a better position to sift the advice you want to take from a few things that you might want to not heed.
And I mean, it's okay, you know, I'll sometimes say, you know, eat a bowl of ice cream, watch a comfort show, then come back and read this again. Like, human beings don't feel good when someone tells you that something you've done needs work. Like, that's just a natural feeling. So it's okay to feel that way, and as long as you don't stay there, you know, like sit in it for a little bit, then move past it, because it's not gonna, pretending like you don't feel upset when you get a piece of criticism isn't gonna work. And so to build too on what Marie said, like, we want you to succeed. Like, editors want authors to succeed. We want you to go out there and put out a great book that wins prizes, and, you know, like, we're invested in you doing well. So
yeah,
that's not evil.
Yeah. And again, this project, this story is your baby. You need to give it time to gestate.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm sure we've all seen is that, okay, I want to get this out by this, so like I want it edited in 2 weeks. Well, you're not going to get time to weigh the options, weigh the ideas, and you really need to let them set and percolate a bit. But that is about it for time for us. So thank you all for joining us. This has been Editors Aren't Always Evil. Maureen McGuigan, Francis Beck, Tara Avery. I'm Kyle Hawk on behalf of Editors BC and Word Vancouver. Thank you. Do check out editors.ca, Editors Canada, our parent organization. There are job boards, other information if you are trying to find an editor and connect with one. And
Or if you want to be an editor.
Yeah.
Got information on that too.
Plenty of it. Thank you.